All right, now we're going to implement buttons. Our buttons have quite a few variations in terms of size and color. So we have these orange buttons where we're using our accent color. We have this other kind of button without a background color. So we only have an outline here. We can call these buttons outline buttons. Now look at the size of this button. This button has stretched to fill the container. So in terms of the size, we have two types of buttons. Some buttons only stretch to fit their content, like the search button up here. So this button has stretched to fit the content. In contrast, we have this other kind of button that has stretched to take up all the available space. We can call these buttons block buttons. Just like we have block elements with the width of 100%, we can also have block buttons with the width of 100%. Now down below, you can see the hover effect of an outline button. Also, in the call to action section, we have another button with the secondary color. So we're going to implement these buttons, but how about you pause the video and build these buttons on your own? Because you have all the necessary skills, all the necessary knowledge to implement these buttons on your own. So pause the video, do your best to implement these buttons, then come back see my implementation for some additional tips and tricks. So I'm going to add a button element with two classes, BTN and BTN primary. This is the skin that gives it the primary color. Let's say by now. Now for the styles, we're going to define a new section called buttons. First, we're going to define the structure. So I'm going to set the font size to 1.8 rem. That is for mobile. For desktop, our buttons are going to have a smaller font. We'll talk about that later. Then we're going to set the font weight to 600. Now our buttons always have uppercase letters. So we set text transformation to uppercase. Now for padding, I'm going to use 2 rems of vertical padding and 3 rems of horizontal padding. Let's see our changes up to this point. So here's what we get. Next, we need to get rid of this ugly border and make the border round. So we set border to 0 and border radius to 40 pixels. All right, so here we have a button without a skin. So let's define a few skin classes. The first one is BTN primary. Here we're going to set the background to color primary and the text to white. Then we're going to define the secondary buttons. So here I'm going to set the background to secondary color and the text color to white as well. Now you might say, wouldn't that be better to define this property in the button element itself? We can certainly do that to remove the duplication, but I like to keep this close to the background color so we can see both the text and background color in one place. And logically, this is really about skinning. So we want to separate the structure from the skin, right? Now, the third skin class is BTN accent. Let's set the background to the accent color and the text color as well. Good. So take a look. That looks beautiful. Now let's test our other classes. So back to our markup, I'm going to use our secondary button. This is working, beautiful. And finally, our accent buttons. Always test your code as you go. Don't assume that your code is always going to work. So our buttons are working. Now back to our markup, sometimes we want to apply these classes to anchor elements. So let's see if our buttons still work. So I'm going to add an anchor with 2 classes. And let's set the label to buy now. All right, seems to be working. Now look at the mouse pointer when I hover it over the anchor. We see the hand, right? But this doesn't happen on the button. I would like to have the same pointer when we hover our mouse over button elements. This makes them look clickable. So here in the button class, we add a new property called cursor. We set it to pointer. Good. Now one more property I want to add is white space. I want to set it to no wrap. So in case we have limited space, I don't want the text in the button to wrap onto a second line. And the last step is to sort these lines so our code is nice and clean. Beautiful. So we're done with this step. Now let's implement the hover effect. So for each of these classes, I want to define a hover state right next to them. So primary, hover. Now, what should we set the background to? Well, our design doesn't currently show the the hover effect of orange buttons. So here we have to use the eye picker, select this color, then bring up the color picker panel and manually select a different color. I'm going to brighten it a little bit and then copy this value. Now, where should we store this value? Well, there are a few options. We can define them in our color palette, but that's going to add some noise to our color palette. The other option is to add them here. But with this, we're going to have some colors defined in our color palette and some other colors defined in various places. So neither of these approaches is ideal. My preference is to use CSS preprocessors like Sass and Less. With Sass, we have a function called lighten. So we can call this function, give it our primary color, and then say lighten this up by 10%. When we compile our code, eventually this line of code is going to be replaced with an actual color value. So with this method, we're still going to have a single place where we have defined our primary color, that is our color palette. And whenever we need variations of this color, we can use the functions that come with Sass, like lighten and darken. Now, Sass requires its own course. It's not something I can cover in this course, but I'm planning to create a comprehensive course on Sass in the future. Maybe by the time you're watching this, my Sass course is ready as well. So for now, I'm just going to go with a hard-coded value here because I don't want to pollute our color palette. And I'm assuming that it's unlikely that we're going to redesign this website with completely new colors. So I'm happy with this. Now for our secondary buttons, once again, we're going to define another rule. And here I'm going to set the background to, let me look at my cheat sheet. So that's going to be 00C8EB in case you want to use the same color. And finally, for our accent buttons, we're going to set the background to EC3000. Good. Now let's take a look. So everything is working. Let's also test the hover effect on primary and secondary buttons. Again, always test your code. Don't make any assumptions. Oops, did you see what happened? This is exactly what I was talking about. I made a mistake. So back to our style sheet. For our primary buttons in the hover state, I'm going to use 3A 8FFD. That's a lighter blue. Then we have the secondary buttons. And for accent buttons, we have this lighter orange. Good. Let's test it one more time. That is working. The difference is really subtle. Now you can pick a different value. That's totally fine. That's not our focus here. So we're done with these skins. The next skin we're going to implement is for block buttons. So let's define a new class called btn _block. We're going to set the width to 100%. And we should also set display to inline block because anchor elements are inline by default. And if you give them a width, that's not going to work. So we have to change the display to inline block. Now I'm going to make both these buttons block buttons. So btn block and btn block. Great. Now look, for anchor elements, our text is not in the center. And also the button is wider than the screen. Why is this happening? Well, because we haven't set box sizing. So the horizontal padding that we have set is added on top of 100%. That is why this particular button is wider than the screen. Now, the reason this is not happening to our button element is because by default, browsers set box sizing of button elements to border box. So back to our structure. To make sure that the text is always in the center of the button, we have to apply text align and set it to center. Good. That problem is solved. Now the sizing problem. Back to our style sheet. On the top, we're going to define a rule using the universal selector. So we're going to grab all elements as well as all elements that are dynamically inserted after or before them. For these, we're going to set box sizing to border box. If you're not familiar with this concept, you need to go back, watch the second part of this series. I covered this in detail. Now let's see if the problem is solved. Okay, great. So we have built these buttons in isolation and they seem to be working fine. The last thing I want to add is some vertical margin to separate these from other elements. So back to our button class. Here we can apply a margin of 1 rem and 0. So 1 rem vertical and 0 horizontal. That's better. So we're done with the mobile version. Now the desktop version. That's pretty easy. We just need to reduce the font size. So at the end, we define a media query. for screens that are wider than 1024 pixels. Here we're going to set the font size for our buttons to, what should we use here? Well, back to our design. Here's the standard version. Look at the size of this font. This is 15 pixels, okay? Now, look at this button over here. This one is 15 pixels as well. Now, look at this button. This one is 14 pixels. So you will encounter issues like this in a real design. Again, sometimes these are accidental, sometimes they're deliberate. I don't think 1 pixel difference is going to be the end of the world. So I'm going to go with 15 pixels consistently. So let's set this to 1.5 rems. Now, here's the mobile version and here's the desktop version. Great. Actually, I just realized that I forgot to implement outline buttons. So let's look at my implementation real quick. We have two rules here, BTN outline, where we set the background to white, the color to the same color we use for our headings, and we apply a border of 2 pixels in the same color. We have another rule for the hover effect, where we set the background to the same color we use for our headings, and we make the text white.